Hello class, and welcome to the module on the separation of powers. So, I'm here late at night in this ridiculous sweater that I found in my mom's attic back when I was in college to talk to you about the separation of powers, right? But that's a bit of a misnomer because we're not talking about the separation of powers. We're in fact talking about the lack of the separation of powers as a function of the expansion of public policy. Now that's what the authors are really getting at here, but you know, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the very beginning. What the authors begin with in this reading, Jenkins and Milkus, what they're talking about is they introduce this really important observation that the relationship between the American people, the United States government, and public policy has dramatically shifted, has seen a remarkable transformation since after World War II. During the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy administration, and definitely during the Johnson administration, during the Warren Court era, and the expansion of civil rights during the Warren Court is when the Bill of Rights was really incorporated into state law and thus national law, definitely with a substantial help from Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP. But it was during this time period where a new policy mindedness emerged in American government. And we kind of we shifted our expectations of what government should do and what policy needs to be in American, democracy. And all of this shift is interesting and it's pretty paradoxical because it extends across both political parties, right? Traditionally speaking, we can think of, Democrats as big government supporters versus Republicans as small government supporters. But in reality, as the authors highlight, both political parties now are actively seeking policy change, right? It's just the policy change looks different, but it's nonetheless reform that everyone's seeking. Everyone has big policy initiatives, big policy platforms, big policy agendas and ambitions, right? Even if they're Republican. A great example that the reading discusses is with respect to Newt Gingrich, right? Definitely a proponent of small government, but when he sought to, for instance, end welfare as we know it, same with that's a Bill Clinton slogan, but it was Newt Gingrich, and as Speaker of the House, that was able to really push welfare reform. But he didn't seek to actually end welfare reform, right? Abolish it, remove it from existence. In fact, he sought to reform it and to add new regulations on it, right? To also give more rights to the states, right? To create block grants. This was reform. It wasn't actually the removal and the pulling back of government as much as we would like to think about with respect to conservatism, right? So this is thinking about how public policy is reshaping the way that American government functions. And so let's look at some slides.
Okay, so these slides in this module are titled The Separation of Powers. However, what we're thinking about here is how the separation of powers has eroded as a function of the increase of policy mindedness, as the authors put it. It's the expansion of big policy after World War II, during the late 1960s and 70s, what Franklin Roosevelt said about it when he was starting with the New Deal. It did arguably start to begin. The groundwork was laid during the New Deal, and he said it was the day of enlightened administration, right? And that this had finally arrived, right? Government was finally going to do what it's supposed to be doing. And this increased the powers and the responsibility and the expectations of government. But it's super paradoxical, okay? Paradox is all over this reading, right? Because on the one hand, we have this increase, this explosion of government responsibilities, right? Now it's the government responsibility to provide social safety nets in the face of emergencies, but also in the face of personal emergencies, of unemployment, poverty. There are certain rights understood by, what is it to be an American? You have the right to health care, for instance. This is new in the post-World War II era, but now we sort of understand it to be kind of like a fact, but this is all very very new. The explosion of government responsibilities shaped new definitions of public problems, right? What do we see as a problem in our society, and how can government take action to solve these problems, right? Public policy got broader, and Americans are expecting more from government. And then at the same time, paradoxically enough, this expansion of public policy, of the responsibilities of government during the late 60s and 70s, then goes hand in hand with a rapid and important increase in the distrust of government. Right? It has to do with disenfranchisement and overselling of policy reforms, right? People were overly optimistic about what government could do. And so when these sorts of reforms didn't quite work out as expected, we are more critical of government. We are more distrustful and cynical about authority and intervention, right? And this is interestingly enough, this is also across parties. We think about the scope of policy reform and public policy initiatives and ambition as extending into both parties, both Republican and Democrat, right? Where it's like least expected with the Republican Party because they're conservative. Well, when it comes to big government and distrust, the authors note that this distrust was most notable and rising at the most rapid rate with Democrats, who want the big government the most, right? So we're riddled with paradox here. And it's summed up really wonderfully by Jenkins and Milkus here on page 6, thinking about Johnson and the Great Society and the expansion of, these kinds of liberalism in government with this quotation: "The vision of the Great Society itself held that an active and energetic national state was no less dangerous than it was necessary." This paradox is just beautifully summed up with this quotation. Now, at the heart of this paradox, though, is this, this idea of what should we expect government to do, and also the distrust of government as it has authority and intervenes in our lives. This simultaneous tension, this paradox, right, all stems back to the role of government. And guided by Madison, the founders were very fearful of this sort of dangerous nation state, right? They had that in mind from the get-go, and they shaped a constitutional framework that, wherein ambition counteracts ambition, as Madison wrote in Federalist number 51, right? That separation of powers and checks and balances could inhibit the lawmaking power and the authority and the intervention of government in the lives of American citizens. And this is where civil liberties come in, right? It's protecting the people from the government itself. So how does this end up working out? Well, we have the three branches, first of all, in the separation of powers. And the judiciary as an institution was intended to be the arbitrator of law. It was not intended to be a law-making institution. Early on, while the founders did not put judicial review into the Constitution, John Marshall, who was in fact a strong Federalist, and that means that he was amongst those like John Adams who were in strong support of a strong national government. He institutionalized judicial review, which is the greatest power of the judiciary, and is the power to strike down laws that the court deems unconstitutional, the Supreme Court deems unconstitutional, and thus lower courts can use judicial review as well. So this, again, this is a veto point, though. It's a negative thing. It's a way to say laws are unconstitutional and thus cannot be enacted. It's not inherently meant to create law. However, what we see throughout, especially the 20th century, are what are often understood to be activist courts. Now, this is where the use of judicial review is prominent, so much such that it actually ends up creating policy, right? And litigants now have been, utilizing the courts as an alternative pathway to reform, right? With the rise, and then we get it in Melnick chapter 4. There's a whole section. I highly recommend reading this chapter if you're interested. There's a whole section on to enforce is to interpret, right? With the rise and the critical efficiency of legal advocacy groups like the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund, litigation has empowered the courts to interpret how protections under the Bill of Rights should be enforced, making things like segregation in schools, the infringement of the rights of criminals, and or even just simply like employment discrimination, especially in this last court. These are now made illegal by interpretation of the court, and that's policy reform. It is also a necessary expansion of the state and the national government, because before these efforts by those like Thurgood Marshall were engaging in legal advocacy with the civil rights movement, the Bill of Rights largely did not apply to states, and states could decide on their own what kinds of citizen rights were protected or left unprotected and often abused. And speaking of the states, let's dive deeper into federalism, because our federalist system is at the heart of this long history of conflict over the national government's power. Madison argued that a federalist system would complement the separation of powers because it would be a, quote, double security to the rights of the people, end quote, by protecting them from the national government, right? So these two government systems are insulated from each other, thus protecting from big policy, frankly. So Madison, by the way, was with Jefferson as one of the first founding members of the Democratic Republican Party, who fought against folks like John Adams and Hamilton and Chief Justice John Marshall, who those guys wanted to increase the power of the federal government, right? Again, John Marshall was the guy who in fact established the power of judicial review, which gets us back to that previous slide, and it's all very dramatic. But shifting attention back to the post-World War II era. States are often now promoting and enhancing national reform rather than inhibiting it, right? While the traditional conception of social welfare policy with respect to federalism has always been that states will compete against each other to minimize, right, necessary spending on federal programs. Now, the idea here is this race to the bottom, and at it is that states, by offering less benefits than a neighboring state, will push populations that are in highest demand of benefits out of the state, right? Thus minimizing state spending on benefits. And this theory then is promoting this idea that states are in competition to minimize benefit spending and thus will offer less social welfare benefits, right? A race to the bottom. But what the authors point out is that this is not actually the case. And this is at least true since the Second World War in many respects, right? Rather than stymieing social welfare spending, policy expansion has been designed such that it incentivizes cooperation and increased spending, both by the national and state governments, right? They're working together in what LBJ called cooperative federalism, as he designed matching grants for the funding of Medicare and Medicaid, right? These matching grants incentivize state governments to provide as much benefit in healthcare as possible, because in doing so, they maximize their grant funding from the national government, right? So everyone is incentivized to increase policy, to increase benefits in this respect. Other scholars note that states often act as laboratories for federal policy, right? And a good example of this is Obamacare, which ironically enough was based on the Massachusetts healthcare reform signed into law by none other than the then Governor Mitt Romney. Now, all of this to say, as the scope of public policy and reform has rapidly expanded, so too has cooperation between state and federal government in reshaping and broadening the role of government overall. It's really hard to imagine, honestly, what Madison would think about all of this.
Now, I get excited about this because here we go again with paradox, right? Because the traditional veto points in our Constitution, the states and courts, what were there and institutionalized within our Constitution by the founders to offer checks and balances, are actually creating policy, right? Veto points are, negative they strike down policy. But these veto points are actually somehow working to create policy. It's paradoxical. And it's interesting because these institutions that were meant to provide checks and balances towards policy making, towards the role of government, to the increasing power of lawmaking, are in fact some, and especially, the national government, right, to protect, against lawmakers in the national government, are in fact some of the most, in Jenkins and Milkis's terms, the biggest vanguards of the national policy, of national reform. It's super paradoxical.
Okay, let's just take a look at one more space wherein this is true, because this is, we're finally getting to the presidency, where the separation of powers is and was most explicit. By the view of the founders, the dominant policymaker needed to be the legislative branch. The executive had the power to veto, again, a negative check on Congress's power. But the executive's power was quite ambiguously, in fact, defined as the executor of laws. The executive was to ensure that laws were properly enacted. Now, what does this mean? Well, historically, not much, but post-World War II, and especially in the last 20 years, it has meant quite a bit. The authors bring up two main points I want to highlight here. First, that there has been a blurring of the boundary between the two presidencies, right? These two presidencies, in quotations, refer to the president's authority over foreign affairs, one, which is historically more robust with respect to his role as commander-in-chief, and then two, his or her historically more limited power over domestic affairs, which again, based on the founders, were specified primarily under the purview of Congress, right? It was Congress that did most of domestic affairs. Now, increasingly, however, with new threats like terrorism and with the increasing power of the Department of Homeland Security, which was established after 9/11, and even in its name is blurring the lines between the two presidencies, the executive's power and responsibility with respect to American security, where these begin and end, is something constantly under debate. And now the second and related piece here is with respect to executive action, or put differently, the consistent and ever-expanding use of executive orders and implementation policy as directed by the president, which often kind of commandeer the powers of the legislature to make policy. Congress is marred in gridlock, and as a result, presidents have taken it on themselves to make policy where Congress can't, right? It's as simple as that. And each president pushes a little farther, and the opposition party in Congress always cries foul. But it's pretty consistently, every president, no matter party, is doing it, right? President Obama set new standards by making broad and sweeping policy change with respect to environmental regulation, also with respect to immigration. And President Trump has pushed this power to even greater historic highs.
Okay, so the major takeaway we want to come away from this reading with is that in the post-World War II era, the expansion of public policy and the politics of policy reform have become so embedded in our governing systems that the institutions the founders created to constrain political ambition are in fact enhancing and serving political ambition. And it's fascinating. Now, is it good? Is it bad? The authors, punt with that question, and they leave it up to us. They leave it up to you in a wonderful way. And, it's a complicated question because, we can think about civil rights, the incorporation and, expansion and protection of civil rights as a function of African-American activism in the 50s and 60s. That activism that expanded and the rightful interpretation of the 14th Amendment to protect the rights of everyone in the United States. All of that was good stuff. But when it comes to, for instance, education reform, as the authors suggest, sometimes the expansion of education policy actually inhibits good education. right? It creates constraints in local levels through teachers unions and those protections, as well as through state and federal government funding issues. There are all kinds of different complications with respect to the expansion of public policy in that realm that could be deemed bad. So it's a complicated question. One question we are going to consider in Thursday's class is we're going to think about how this expansion of public policy and policy mindedness in the United States since World War II has influenced partisan politics. Has it influenced partisan polarization? Something to think about. So that's on the next page for your module, and that's what we'll be thinking about in the beginning of Thursday's class. In the meantime, get some rest. I know I'm going to try, and I can't wait to see you on Zoom.